Greetings, this is Megan Raymond with WCET. So glad to see so many new and familiar faces with us here today. We had over 500 people register, so I know that people are going to continue pouring in. But let's go ahead and get started. We have a lot we want to cover today. Thank you, Blackboard Collaborate, for making this platform available. I know many of you are familiar with Blackboard. It has a chat box, which you'll see on the lower left, and that's how we'll communicate with you today. So as you have questions, go ahead and enter them into the chat box. I'll be moderating that as we go along. If you have any resources to share or comments, feel free to use that to interact with each other as well as the presenters. We are recording this webcast. We'll make it available along with the link to the PowerPoint and the recorded archive next week. As you have questions, do enter them in the chat box. We're going to try and hold questions toward the end of this session, and it's going to be a pretty brief presentation followed by conversation today, and then we'll get to your questions. But as they come up, please do enter them, and then I'll be pulling those out, trying to keep on track of them. Today our moderator is Dr. Vernon Smith. He's the Special Consultant to the Provost for Online Programs at Portmont College at Mount St. Mary's, which is a really innovative institutional model. He'll talk a little bit about it. They're getting ready to enroll their first students, I believe, in this upcoming fall. And previously, Dr. Smith was at Rio Salado. So I'd like to go ahead and introduce Vernon.
Thank you, Megan. I appreciate that, and welcome to everyone that's here. Megan, we actually did launch our first cohort in January of this year, and starting another cohort just this Monday to a very successful launch of a startup greenfield institution I'm very happy to be part of. I'm also very pleased to be able to participate in this conversation about competency-based education today. And I think you'll find that there's two themes that will emerge here. And by the look of the number of participants we have, this should be a dynamic and fun-filled conversation. The first theme that I think you'll see is that even though we advertise it this way, it's not a trend. It's not like a MOOC. Competency-based education is based on real knowledge, real research, and real practice around teaching and learning, and it will affect higher ed. This will be something that is not flash in the pan. It will be ongoing, and I believe it will be around for a while. The second part of this, I think you'll see, is that there's a lot of hard work involved, that it is emerging, but we know that to do things right, we need to design it correctly. And in conversation with Dr. David LeSueur, who's at Western Governors, he pointed out that even though they've been early in the game on this, that they're not expecting everyone to follow the Western Governors model necessarily, but everyone has to figure this out for yourselves. That said, let's move on to let me introduce quickly our presenters today. Dr. Linda Howdyshell is the Provost and Senior Vice President of Academic and Student Success at Broward College, where she began in the fall of 2010. Prior to her Broward experience, Dr. Howdyshell was Chief Administrative Officer at the Chino campus of the Chaffey College in Southern California. She is an exceptionally gifted professional with lots of experience at every educational level. She served as strategic and annual planner, mediator, governance officer, Perkins coordinator, dean, vice president, and provost. She has a PhD from Michigan State University in college and in university administration, and a master's and bachelor's degrees from Central Michigan University. And we're very pleased to have you with us this morning, Linda. Dr. Mary Alice McCarthy is Senior Policy Analyst in the Education Policy Program at New America, where she examines the relationship between higher education policy, workforce development policy, and the efforts to improve career and educational outcomes for especially low-income and non-traditional students. Since joining New America in the fall of 2012, she's been conducting research specifically on competency-based education and non-credit education at community colleges, with the goal of identifying best practices for helping students earn their credentials with labor market value, and that's key. Prior to joining New America, she worked at both the U.S. Departments of Education and Labor, which give her great insights. Dr. McCarthy has a Master in Public Administration from the Harvard Kennedy School of Government and a PhD in Political Science from the University of North Carolina. At Harvard, she was the 2009 Fellow in Philanthropy at the Hauser Center for Nonprofit Organizations, where she did research on the role of philanthropic organizations in supporting innovative approaches to workforce development and adult education. And thank you, Mary Alice, and thank you, Linda, for joining us this morning, and we look forward to your presentation. And we'll let you take it from here.
Go ahead and hit the talk.
And looking at this, go ahead.
Oh, sorry, I just wanted to remind Mary Alice to go ahead and hit the talk button.
Oh, hello. My apologies for that. This is Mary Alice. Can you hear me now? Hello?
We can hear you.
Oh, great. Okay, I'm going to go back one slide. So first of all, Vernon, thank you very much for that kind introduction, and thank you to WCET for hosting this webinar and for letting me be a part of it. It's a real privilege. I was thinking, just to get things started, just wanted to sort of present a quick overview of sort of what I think Linda and I are hoping to cover in very brief comments before we get to the discussion period of the webinar, which is just a quick overview of what is competency-based education. You know, why now? What's going on? A quick, again, review of or a few quick examples of who's doing it and how they're doing it. A quick discussion on what's hard to do about it, both from a federal regulatory and policy standpoint and also from an institutional standpoint. And then what are the pros and cons or the risks and opportunities of competency-based education. So with that, I'll get started with the question of what is it? And it is, depending, it's many things. There's not one single definition of competency-based education, but I think that the core of it, we would all agree, is that competency-based education is an approach to teaching and learning that measures learning outcomes rather than time. So in a competency-based education program, students advance upon mastering the concepts or mastering the material rather than on completing the course period. In a competency-based education model, the competencies are explicit, they're measurable, they're transferable. It's an approach to education that makes the learning outcomes more explicit, more visible, and potentially more tangible for both the students themselves and then also for employers who would be interested in those competencies. Competency-based education models, too, are built around very rigorous assessment methods, and we can talk a little bit more about what those look like. But basically, because the focus is so much upon measuring learning and not time, assessments are absolutely a key to competency-based education, and sort of the whole approach hinges on the quality of those assessments. And finally, I want to just mention that competency-based education as a strategy opens up all sorts of possibilities in terms of different delivery modes for education that enable more personalized learning approaches and potentially, we'll talk about this in a minute, enable sort of different and possibly more cost-effective approaches to delivering higher education. So with that, I want to go to the next slide, which sort of does a quick side-by-side of how a competency-based education approach might differ from a more traditional approach to education. And again, sort of looking at these two broad categories of how students advance and how programs are delivered, we see some real important and real substantial differences. In terms of how students advance, obviously I've said, we've been through this, but it's based on learning and not on time. Mastery is different than grades. In a competency-based program, a student either demonstrates proficiency or mastery or does not, as opposed to sort of in a traditional program where students can advance based on different levels of mastery of the content. Another important thing about competency-based education is that it is location indifferent or location neutral. Where the learning was acquired really doesn't matter as long as the student can demonstrate it. And that again gets back to the, it isn't that the student has to spend a certain amount of time in a particular seat in a particular class in order to have the opportunity to demonstrate that they understand the content. They can do that as soon as they sit down. So that's a very important feature. And finally, in terms of student advancement, obviously competency-based education allows for students to advance in a self-paced way. They do not have to move in lockstep with the class that they are enrolled in. The other really, I think, revolutionary aspect of or potential of competency-based education does have to do with how it can be delivered. This is where we get into the whole issue of the unbundling of education that competency-based education potentially opens up. And that is that under traditional models, of course, we have a bundled approach to education, which a faculty person generally writes the syllabus, develops the course content, delivers the course, and then grades the students. And in a competency-based program, these pieces can be unbundled from one another. And you can have different people designing the courses, then who are delivering the courses, then who are working or mentoring or coaching students, and then a completely different set of people who are grading or assessing student progress. So it does imply, or can imply, not necessarily, but it can imply a very significant change to the faculty model and to just how we think of delivering education. So again, and you can see that gets to the difference between mentors and instructors, and under the CBE approach, it's very different. It can be very different than the traditional instructional model, and we can certainly talk about that more as well as we move forward. But just a quick side-by-side there then. Then I just wanted to say a few words about, why are we talking about competency-based education so much these days? I mean, you really can't, you can't open an issue of the Chronicle or of Inside Higher Ed without seeing a story about competency-based education. It's everywhere. The president's talking about it. It's on everybody's minds these days. And I would second Vernon's point that it might be tempting to think of this as a fad, but I do think that there are a number of sort of structural changes going on in our labor markets and in our just in the costs of higher education and the demands of the labor market that are really sort of providing a pretty strong foundation for a more competency-based approach to higher education. I refer to these as sort of a perfect storm of conditions that reinforce this growing interest in competency-based. One, obviously, just being the tremendous increase in the demand for post-secondary skills and credentials, but also just the enormous changes we've seen in the number of adult and non-traditional students who come to higher education with a different set of experiences, different needs potentially, and also different possibilities and strengths that they can use in order to advance in their program. And then, of course, we all know about the rising cost of post-secondary education, so anything we can do to sort of find new delivery strategies that allow students to advance more quickly and in a more cost-effective way are likely to get a lot of support. And then finally, there are some real doubts about actual learning outcomes in college, and I think we've been hearing a lot about that, and I think that's also sort of fueling the interest in competency-based education. We've seen reports, and I realize that these are controversial, but still, there are some questions about what are the learning outcomes for students in higher education, and of course I'm referring to the famous Academically Adrift study. And then we're also seeing employer survey after employer survey basically stating that they're not finding that students are leaving higher education with the skills they need to be effective in the workplace. So one thing, too, that I think is important about competency-based education is the degree to which it sort of clarifies or begins to address this issue of what are students learning in college and how can we make those things more visible. So and then finally, of course, with all of these technological advances, I do think, since the invention of radio, we've been hearing that technology was going to replace, place-based education, and obviously that hasn't happened. But we have seen lately some really, over the last decade, some really incredible advances in online education that I think really do create possibility for much more high-quality personalized online learning, and the advances in data analytics combined with the ability to transmit really high quality video and animation combined with growing access to the internet, it does seem like finally we might be hitting a tipping point where we can really see some pretty fundamental changes in how we deliver higher education through technology. So I'm sure that there are other things that I've missed here, but these are just some factors that I think make folks like me, and I'm sure hopefully, well, and I think some other folks think that this is really not a passing trend in higher education, but sort of a direction that we will see the sector moving for a while to come. So finally, I want to just talk for a minute before handing things over to Linda about who's doing competency-based education and how. And as I was sitting here getting ready for the presentation to start, I saw a whole lot of people from institutions that are doing competency-based education. I just have a couple of examples here. But the truth is that there are a lot of institutions doing competency-based education and doing it through a whole bunch of different sort of models and different approaches. There's Rio Salado College, there's the University of Maryland University College, we see her on the webinar, Northern Arizona University, Charter Oaks College, Sinclair Community College, and I'm sure there's others that have joined since I last checked. But there are many different models. The ones that I have here are just a few that I think capture some of the diversity within competency-based education models. The first obviously being Western Governors University, which I'm guessing since we're talking to the Western states that you all are very familiar with this model, so I don't want to spend a lot of time on it, but I do just want to mention that this was sort of the perhaps not the first, but certainly the first large-scale approach to delivering competency-based education. Western Governors is based, their programs enroll almost 40,000 students, and they have a fully sort of unbundled faculty model. It's a fully online program, and it's a fully unbundled faculty model with one group of faculty that works with students, another that develops content, and another that works on assessing student progress. They do deliver both bachelor's and master's degrees in just 4 fields. And the whole impetus for the program was a group of governors getting together and wanting to find a way to develop a institution of higher education that would more sort of tightly meet the workforce development or skill development needs of their states in 4 key sectors, those being nursing, information technology, teaching, and business administration. So one thing I just want to mention about Western Governors University, again, is that this is a subscription model approach to higher education in which students enroll for a 6-month period, and over that, and they pay $3,000, and over that 6-month period, they advance as far as they can in their program, completing as many competencies as they can. And it's a very different approach, obviously, than your usual 12-credit semester-based program. Western Governors has had quite a bit of success with this approach, with very good outcome data, and I think it's also worth noting that most of their students are adult students who already have some college, and their average age is 37. So, that is one model or one approach to providing competency-based education. Again, I'm reluctant to go into the details of it because I just think most of you know that, so I'm just going to mention these other 4 really quickly. Southern New Hampshire is, of course, a relatively newer entrant to the competency-based education arena, and it is one of only 2 institutions right now, the other being Capella University, that have been granted authority by the Secretary of Education to do a direct assessment program. I think we'll get into it a little bit more about what that means, but this is for associate's degrees students. These are students who are at a very different place than students in Western Governors University. So these are students who are incumbent workers. Southern New Hampshire is working with employers to enroll their workers who lack associate's degrees into these programs. And again, it's fully online and self-paced and also a subscription model. Then we also have Kentucky Community and Technical Colleges Learn on Demand, and I think there's some folks from KCTCS on the line here. This is a different approach too. It's not a subscription model, but rather a course-based model in which students enroll in a course and then can complete it as quickly as they are able, and again, able to advance at their own time rate. And then we have Capella University, and again, that's for certificates and associate degrees. And then we have Capella University that is offering both bachelor's and master's degrees. So what we're seeing is that competency-based education models are popping up that are delivering education to students from very different backgrounds, from first-time college goers to adults with significant college experience. It's delivering education at every spectrum, from certificates to associate's degrees to bachelor's and master's. And there are a variety of different models and a lot of experimentation going on, so it's a very exciting time. One of the places that's doing a lot of that's developing an exciting new program, of course, is Broward College. And so with that, I'll pass it over to Linda.
Hi, Linda. This is just your reminder to go ahead and click the talk button as well.
I did. Now you can hear me?
Yes, success.
Oh, well, good. I was just saying that Mary Alice and I talked yesterday, and we agreed that she was giving the kind of overview, and I'm moving us right down to a college and how we're putting this in place. I feel as though we're one of the newbies in this area, and so I will tell you what we're doing and not suggest that this is the way to do it. Our program has rolling start dates of every 2 weeks. Students may start in the program. We actually have had students who were able to prove through an assessment that they could pass a course, and it wound up costing them $21 versus over $300. And we've embedded in our program technical certificates and also career placement services. The competency-based learning model that we have is all in IT, and it was initially started with a TAC grant. The TAC grant allowed us to work with Western Governors and with some other institutions such as Sinclair and Austin to develop this competency-based learning model all online. Each of the 3 colleges have taken a different specialty, and when we complete our grant, we will all have access to all 3 programs. Ours is a tech specialist or a technician for computers, computer services. Austin is doing a programming, and Sinclair is doing networking. But as you look at this chart, you can see that we've built into it we've laddered industry certifications as students move along, so that as they finish each of the certifications, they are tested and then can move into the next area. I thought that it would be useful to talk about a student. This particular student, and we're noticing that several of our students have come from the military, or they have been working in IT for some time, and they really need at this point some kind of a credential to justify that they can continue in the area and that they really know what they're doing. So this student was able to take this program in a very short amount of time, earn all of these certificates as well as and those all counted for his AS degree. We're finding that the students that are attracted to this are, as Mary Alice mentioned earlier, they're older students. They're students that bring in some expertise. We have not found it to be particularly successful with younger students. We currently have about 75 students in this program, and next fall we'll be starting a second competency-based program, which will be in supply chain management and logistics. One of the things that we have, and let me just talk a little bit about our issues as we started to develop this program, is that first of all, our faculty were not used to doing anything but lecturing. And this model is very, very different. They are facilitators, they are coaches, they are not lecturers. And for some of them, that was extremely difficult. The other area that we had some questions around was accreditation. Our accrediting body, which is SACS, SACS-COC, has now developed a plank that says that they will accept competency-based instruction. So they're very supportive, and they have said that they're not the ones holding us back to moving in this direction. We have had some questions around financial aid, and because of the financial aid regs, we've had to make sure that our competency-based instruction or program courses all fell within a term, because the financial aid is given on terms. And so that is currently one of the things that is keeping us from being, say, more aggressive in this area. And I guess, Mary Alice, you're going to talk about this next slide?
Sure, I'd be happy to, and I'll also keep it brief because, Linda, I think you hit on the big issues. I mean, we know that federal reconciling a competency-based approach, which is a time-independent or self-based approach with Title IV requirements, is challenging, and we've been hearing that from institutions for a long time, and that makes a lot of sense because, of course, Title IV is organized around time and around the credit hour, particularly the academic year. The definition of an academic year, which is sort of at the foundation of the disbursement of Title IV funds, is very much a time-based definition for a program offered in credit hours. It includes a minimum of 30 weeks of instructional time. When you're trying to design a program in which students, it doesn't matter how long they take, but rather how quickly they can demonstrate mastery, it can be very difficult to map these two onto each other. So the definition of an academic year does make making these programs Title IV eligible difficult. The other thing that I just want to mention is that the Title IV requirements around satisfactory academic progress also pose some real challenges to designers of competency-based education programs, and I'm sure some of the folks on this webinar can explain this better than I can. But according to the regulations, students need to demonstrate satisfactory academic progress by completing a certain number of credit hours in an academic year. And so when you have a program that is not based on credit hours, that's quite difficult. And particularly then when you have programs that are designed around subscription models, say for example the Western Governors model or the Southern New Hampshire model, where a student has 6 months in which to complete a set number of competencies, it can be very difficult to measure. The whole purpose of that is to allow that student to be able to engage with their academic program as they need to and in the time space they need to, rather than on the weekly basis that is required under Title IV regulations, that there be some sort of substantial interaction between students and their instructors during that on a weekly basis. So the freedom that competency-based education programs give students in terms of time is very difficult to reconcile with the requirements around Title IV that measure student advancement generally through both credit hours, which are time-based, all of which ultimately links back to the unit of 1 week. I think institutions have been incredibly creative about ways to get around this, and they generally have found ways, but they're not easy. In the case of Western Governors, for example, they do measure satisfactory academic progress by basically saying that a student has to complete a certain percentage, I believe it's 80%, of the competencies that they attempt to take on. So if a student attempts to complete 16 competencies in a 6-month period, they have to complete 80% of those 16 competencies. Unfortunately, a perverse incentive there then is that students may not want to try a competency, attempt to pass it, if they're afraid that they might not master it, because then they could potentially fall below the 80%. So it has the perverse effect of sort of discouraging students from trying out and testing themselves to see whether or not they can advance. Southern New Hampshire got around the issue by basically saying that in any given subscription period, at the end of any given subscription period, a student has to be on track to complete the 60 competency-based program, it has to be on track to complete the program within 150% of the time period that it should take. Which again is all of this is sort of tracking right back to the credit hour and how we think about time-based programs already. But the SNU program is a 60 competency program, so at any given time a student needs to be on track to complete those 60 competencies within 150% of the 2-year time frame that they consider necessary to do that. So it's complicated, and this is one of the areas right now in which there's a lot of discussion in Washington. The department did just issue a request for suggestions for experimental sites in which they will test what it means to waive some of these requirements and see for competency-based programs to measure how it affects student outcomes. And I know they got a lot of feedback and a lot of suggestions, I'm sure, from many of the institutions that are on this call today. So we're excited to see what comes out of that, what sort of experiments will be forthcoming. But it could be a real exciting opportunity to sort of put some of this stuff to test. And the one thing we discussed on our conversation yesterday, Linda and Megan and I, was the difference between direct assessment approaches to competency-based education and sort of non-direct assessment or more approaches to competency-based education that operate however awkwardly within the credit-based system. And so I just wanted to spend a quick minute, and we can certainly, this might be something again better if there's specific questions about it to flesh out during a question and answer period. But direct assessment authority is something that was added to the Higher Education Act in 2005. The act was amended to include the following authority, which was the authority to measure student learning directly through direct assessment in lieu of credit hours or clock hours. In order to get this authority, you do have to, an institution has to first work with its accreditor to get the program that it is interested in using direct assessment for approved by their accreditor, and then it can apply to the department to get approval to distribute Title IV funds to students enrolled in these programs. So since it was first introduced to the law in 2005, no institution applied for direct assessment authority. Right now, there are 2 institutions that have been granted this authority, and they are Southern New Hampshire University and Capella University, and they are both sort of rolling out these new programs. We're all very excited to see how they do. I will say this, that, and Linda can speak to this more as to why Broward decided not to go this route. Even within these direct assessment programs, institutions are required to map all of the competencies that they have back to credit hours and be able to show to their accreditor and to the department how the learning in a direct assessment based, competency-based program essentially is the same as what the credit hour requirements would be for a traditional program. So it's not clear how much freedom this gives institutions to innovate, but it is there, and it is one of the pathways, towards further innovation, we hope, as we see institutions experiment with the authority and come up with new ways of delivering education. Linda, do you want to talk a little bit about why Broward decided not to go the direct assessment route?
Well, I think I could give you an easy answer. Part of our grant consortium was Western Governors. And Western Governors' model does map everything back to credit hours. And I also think that it was a wise decision because it's almost as though it's a middle ground. And so it was much easier to promote it and advocate it with our faculty than if we had gone to totally a direct assessment. We were not sure that our SAC COC would approve direct assessment either. And so those were the reasons that we stayed with the competency-based model. I see that we have now the challenges for institutions, and certainly the first one is one that I can speak to quite easily. Our faculty are unionized at Broward College, and their salary their contract provides that they will teach a 5-course load or 15 credit hours each of the terms. How does that fit with the competency-based model, where we ask that they do much more coaching, much more facilitating? Does that mean that they won't need the extra time during their week to prepare? We currently are paying our faculty stipends to be coaches for our students in each of these programs, rather than we have not found a way that we have it fit into their regular contractual load. That's something that we certainly want to work on. Faculty are very concerned that this will, as I think Mary Alice alluded to earlier, that this will mean that there won't be work for them, that we're going to use technology to get rid of them. And instead, we need them even more to develop courses and to coach and support the students as they move through their programs. We know that unless students are regularly contacted, unless they feel as though they have a connection to the program and to the school, that they will not be able to complete these programs. This is not programmed learning. This is something very different than that. Obviously, finding reliable assessments is very difficult. IT was probably the easiest to find because there are nationally recognized certificates, assessments that can measure learning outcomes. But when you look at some of the other programs that we would offer, finding a reliable assessment is very difficult. And if we go back to, again, the faculty role, the faculty have for many years or forever been able to decide how they would assess their students. So having a common assessment across many faculty or the entire department is foreign to our faculty. Obviously, we want these competencies to be portable or transferable, and they will of course be that because in IT, because of the national certifications that are tied to them. Our back office systems, as the slide mentions, have been somewhat difficult for us because we were set up to, everything starts at the same time every 8 weeks, and everybody ends at the same time, and you get the records at the same time. And we may have students that will cross that 8-week mark. We may have students that won't finish in December that will need January. And how do we make sure that we record that accurately, that we don't, when they come to finish their course, they aren't charged again? So those are some of the issues that we definitely are looking at. We also look at if a student didn't finish a particular competency in the amount of time that we assumed they would take, what grade do we give them? Because we're required to have some kind of a grade. So we need to, we're working on those issues. And Mary Alice, I think you were going to talk about the risk and opportunities.
Oh gosh, well I hope we both can.
Okay.
But I mean, I think you know, as with any innovation, there are opportunities and risks. There's pros and cons, and I think the one that I hear the most expressed in the area of competency-based, well, the most in the area of competency-based education are the top two here. First of all, are these approaches going to be well suited to adults or vulnerable learners, or I should say at-risk learners? We know from the Western Governors model that it's actually a great approach for adults with some college experience. I think we're wondering and waiting to see whether or not this is going to be an approach that is well suited to learners who might need more support or more structure. It may be that we find that it's actually an excellent approach, and I think experiments at Southern New Hampshire and then the Kentucky Community College system and then some of the other community college systems will help us answer those questions. But that would be one of the biggest concerns. And then another is, are there opportunities for fraud? Obviously, we think a lot about that here in Washington, and when you're thinking about Title IV funds, and whenever you sort of open the door to Title IV funds, this is a major concern. But how do we make sure that there are sufficient safeguards around the quality of these programs, that students aren't being pushed through them faster than is actually warranted, and these places don't turn into diploma mills, obviously, is another major concern. Linda, I don't know if maybe you want to take the next couple?
Sure. We believe, well, certainly the model that we have has reduced the cost for students. I mentioned earlier that, and this is the exceptional student, obviously, had finished what we would call a 3-credit course in a very short amount of time, and it cost him $21 versus the $300. We believe that indeed, if a student wants to accelerate, that they'll be able to reduce the costs. And it says that this questions the quality issue. I think that all of higher ed is being questioned around quality. So I wouldn't answer that question just in terms of competency-based education, but in terms of higher ed as a whole. Is the quality there? How do we know it? How do we measure it? That would be true for competency-based education.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and
I know. You can, Mary Alice, talk about direct assessment, and then I'll talk a little more about the institutional culture.
Great. Okay. And I think that that's another exciting, within the Direct Assessment Authority, an area that may be an opportunity or maybe a risk is the degree to which it opens up opportunities for alternative providers. And if you have a chance to actually review the language on direct assessment, and I think I took that out of the slide that I had, but it does talk about the assessment of learning by other partners, and seems to open up the possibility for sort of partnerships between between colleges and other providers to sort of assess learning. And it's just interesting to think about what that might mean, particularly in areas like career technical education, where it might sort of pave the way for more alternative credentialing and just again ways of better sort of linking programs with the labor market. So that's an area of opportunity. But of course, again, whenever you're sort of opening the door to alternative providers, there's always the risks associated with the quality and how do you sort of accredit or vet these other providers if they're in partnership with institutions, and how is all of that going to work? Back to you, Linda.
The last point on this is about changing institutional culture. And I would agree that certainly the use of technology in this way is a disruptive innovation to our traditional institutional culture. It is very difficult for faculty to see the need to change, and for us, having a grant that embedded in it required competency-based in courses, that has allowed us to make changes. Yes, I think there is a risk with that. I think the risk with the entire competency-based assessment could mean that that we just push students through, as you had mentioned. But certainly competency-based instruction has allowed us to broaden our view of how to use technology. One of the things that would seem probably very evident to everyone is we should have been using technology for advising, but we weren't. And so we started in this conversation of what can we do with technology, how can we utilize it more fully. We obviously have these students that are doing their programs online. We need to do advising for them, and if it's good for them, why wouldn't it be good for our other students? So I see that there can be many changes that competency-based education can bring to the institution. And I believe that that is our last slide, and that, Vernon, are you going to moderate the questions for us?
I will, and I want to start out with a couple of questions, one for Mary Alice and one for you, Linda. Mary Alice, you referred to direct assessment and the mapping of those competencies that map back to the credit hour. In the experimental sites or through direct assessment, do you foresee a time when we can actually break away completely from mapping to the seat time and the credit hour?
Well, I think that that's what some folks would like to test through the experimental authority, and I mean, the experimental authority gives us an opportunity may give us an opportunity to do that, and the department certainly seems open to sort of considering testing those approaches. So I think that that's a real possibility, and we'll see what experiments the department comes up with in the next couple of months. I think they'll be releasing that information, but that's an exciting opportunity to sort of enable institutions to develop really more pure competency-based programs without having to go through all of the trouble then of basically creating the program twice.
I think you said well that I think a lot of us will be watching with interest the results from the Department of Education over the next couple of months. Thank you, Mary Alice. Linda, you talked a little bit about the back office systems, those other things that using technology such as advising. And related to this were questions around how do you handle military students? And these are questions around financial aid and other type of regulations. How is that going in your process and in your pilot here?
Well, we are fortunate that we have a financial aid vice president who does not believe in over compliance or over interpreting. In other words, if the rule isn't stated clearly, then we look and see if we can move ahead with it. So we've been able to, I believe, be a little more flexible than many of the institutions with perhaps more conservative interpretations. We have had difficulty with military, and so we are working on that. The military simply, well, as you all know, they are questioned online in total. And so we have had to scholarship some of those students in.
Great. Here's another question from Paul Stacy from Creative Commons asking about how many of these programs are defining their own competencies, or how many are using national or internationally defined competencies for specific jobs.
Well, the RIT programs are all using nationally recognized certifications, so they are recognized competencies. With the new logistics supply chain management program we're starting, we know that there are no national standards, and in the consortia that we have created for that grant, and I believe there's 20 partners, we will be actually creating the national certification or the national certificate, the certificates, and they will be latticed up to a degree. So for us, we're using a national measure, not just one that we've done here at the college.
And Vernon, if I might, I think that's such an excellent question, and I think it also sort of opens up sort of what is one of the real opportunities with competency-based education. Just because it does sort of ask the question of what are we mapping the competencies back to? And I would say that a number of institutions, I believe, are using the degree qualifications framework that was developed in partnership, with the Lumina Foundation, and I think others are linking back to, as Linda said, to sort of industry-based certifications, and then others are sort of are just working with local employers or local faculty, and then in some cases faculty groups to develop competencies. But I think when you start going down the way of competency-based education, it sort of immediately sort of makes you think in terms of what are these anchored in outside of the particular course, and then of course outside of the institution. So it allows us to start thinking about standards and sort of consistency in learning outcomes across institutions in a way that is really very exciting.
Mary Alice, I appreciate that. I know that the Department of Labor began to look at clusters of different competencies that are based in the market so that they have real labor market value for those students. What do we do
Okay,
those disciplines in areas that are not necessarily heavily or tightly coupled to the market, that are in more of the liberal arts and sciences areas? I was asking, is there a difference between
I think that
some of the close to the market? Yes, go ahead.
So you're asking the difference between like programs that are have more of a career technical focus, that are competency based, sort of have a sort of obvious place to go, sort of in terms of industry competency models to sort of reference or anchor their competencies. But what about liberal arts programs? I think that's a great question. And again, I think the degree qualifications profile is one anchor. I think the LEAP, and pardon me that I know there's people on the call that will know this better than I do, but there is a set of standards developed as part of the LEAP framework, I believe it is. And I apologize for not knowing that. But the folks at Northern Arizona University, and I know there's some on this webinar right now, have done exactly that within the liberal arts framework. And I know the folks in Texas are also doing that. So, I think people are tackling this competency-based, where do we define the competencies? What do we anchor them in from a number of ways? And doing it both in the liberal arts and in the career technical fields. And I would really direct you to the Northern Arizona effort in that. To see how they've done that.
There's another question here about time limits on competencies. Of course, the time-based seat time is directly attached to financial aid. How do we work with that with them achieving mastery level and bounding that within time constraints, or not?
Well, the time constraints that we are most concerned about are the ones that are tied to financial aid. If a student doesn't need financial aid, then we're not concerned with the time limit. So that's being forced upon us because of their need for those resources. And 75% of our students get some kind of financial aid. So that's one of the main reasons we're keeping it within the terms.
There's another question here about time limits imposed on students to read all competencies, and this is from Karen Gatewood at Harcum College. For example, students who have to take a national exam in a health field.
So, and I'm sorry, what is the question though? How to accommodate students who may need to sit for exams?
Exactly, in national
licensing
fields.
Exams and
correct.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think, again, licensing exams and certification exams also, give a real sort of, are a really excellent way for competency-based programs to kind of anchor themselves and also to sort of measure their own effectiveness, like through licensing rates and certification passage rates. In terms of the lining up with the timing, I mean, I think that's mostly up to the students themselves to figure that out. I mean, certification exams obviously you can take whenever, but in terms of licensing exams and how that works, I mean, I know Western Governors works in the healthcare field on this and must have to work with their students in terms of helping them sort of manage their calendar that way. But I think that's mostly sort of up to the students to figure that out.
Well, I would agree.
Linda, you probably have a better sense of this than I do.
Well, I would agree with you, and that's not been an issue with our competency-based program because the tests are built in. But as I think about our nursing program, it is up to the students when they take it. And some of the students take it immediately after they graduate, and some of them wait a year or take it after they've taken a refresher course. So it's very dependent on students.
Another question in general, how are the accrediting agencies approaching or accepting competency-based approaches?
Well, I only know about SACS, and I know that 2 years ago they said they didn't need to have new policies. Then last year, Bell Whelan formed a committee of people who were involved in this, and they came out with guidelines for competency-based education. And I'm quoting her because she said, we're not going to hold you back if this is good for students. So at least in our case, they're being quite flexible. Flexible, maybe I should say they're working with us.
That's good. Mary Alice, there was a question of whether there's a place to go in addition to our example institutions here where people can learn how to develop competencies.
Oh, that's a great question. That is a great question. And, I do think that there are some there's a community of practice among some of the institutions that are developing competency-based models, and I'd love to sort of pose that question to them and get back to you. Can I do that, Brenda? But I think that's a great question. Where do you learn how to develop competency?
And
in terms of industry-based competency models, the Department of Labor has been doing that for some time. But yes, no, Linda, please.
Well, I was just going to say that we found Western governors to be wonderfully open with sharing how they develop the courses, competencies, and so I'm sure that they would be as kind and as willing to work with other colleges. They've actually visited us, I think, 5 or 6 times and led workshops on how to develop competency-based instruction.
Yeah, and I would add to that, I think there's sort of contacting the institutions that are doing it and the state systems that are doing it might be a really excellent place to start. Also, the Texas Higher Education Commission would be a good place to go, as well as the folks in Kentucky if you're looking at the associate degree level.
These are great examples, and we're appreciative of that. Looking down the road, where do you see in the future, as we look at the next year or so, of what will develop around competency-based education? You can look at your magic ball, and just gaze in there.
Linda, you want to?
Well, I don't know if I have a magic, any kind of magic to guess, but I see this as certainly a growing area. As we said earlier, the cost of higher education has become prohibitive for many. The other thing that has caused students to not complete is the length of time it takes, particularly if they have some kinds of developmental issues. I see that competency-based instruction will solve many of those problems, and that they'll be able to move at their own speed and feel as though they're being respected for what they have learned outside of a formal setting.
And I would just second that and just say I think we're going to see a lot more. I think we're going to see a lot more. We're going to see more models, and I think we're going to really start to learn how competency-based education works for different learners at different levels of the higher education spectrum. And that this is it's sort of hard to see us going away from competencies. Once you start to make learning outcomes more visible and more tangible, it's hard to argue for going back in the other direction. One of the things that I would like to see some more experimentation around would be classroom-based, or not classroom-based, but sort of in-person competency-based education. Right now it's very much of an online model, and I think there's ways to sort of start combining more sort of online and in-person approaches to competency-based education, so it's not quite so solitary for learners. And I hope to see some new models in that area.
Well, and I believe we've started in that direction with the learning outcomes and assessing student learning outcomes.
Well, yeah. Thank you. These are this conversation. Obviously, we need to continue this conversation offline and continuing on. Megan, I believe we're hitting the hour, and to be respectful of that, we'll turn it over to you.
Well, thank you, Vernon, Mary Alice, and Linda. I really appreciate this conversation. It was invaluable, and like Vernon said, I think this is just tipping the iceberg. And do consider joining us for a more in-depth conversation May 5th through the 7th in Salt Lake. WCET will present a leadership summit around designing alternative pathways to credentials, and Mary Alice is able to join us for that. Again, thank you to the presenters. This was a wonderful conversation. Vernon did a wonderful job staying on top of all the questions as they came in. We will be sharing these resources on our website next week. What I'd like to do is pull out all of the questions that we were unable to answer today, share those with the presenters, and then collect responses as we can. But I imagine that they'll need a little bit of time, so that may not be included with the link to the archive and the PowerPoint slides. I'll get those to you as soon as possible. Do consider joining WCET if this is your first interaction with us. Membership benefits extend to your entire institution. We have really active news digests, listservs, free webcasts, and other member-only resources. Stay tuned for announcements about our next webcast. Again, thank you to Blackboard Collaborate for making this platform available. Thank you, WCET, supporting members, and our terrific WCET annual sponsors who underwrite so many of our activities: Blackboard, Cengage, CourseSmart, VitalSource, and Pearson Learning Solutions. Again, thank you for joining us today. We look forward to seeing you on the next webcast.